The silence in the room had shifted from tense to unbearable. Each second dragged like an hour, the ticking of the clock cutting through the air like a blade. Daniel tried to shift in his seat, attempting to recover some sense of control, but the alcohol clouded his sharpness and the atmosphere weighed him down. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a guarded uncertainty, and his eyes flickered toward the door as if silently measuring the distance. Lavra sat rigid, her breathing shallow, her face pale as though all the blood had drained from it. She had begun to understand that the night would not end in polite conversation, that Michael had crafted this moment with chilling precision, and that there was no escape. Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice still calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. He spoke of betrayal again, this time without disguise, his words painting vivid images of what it felt like to give your trust to someone only to have it shattered. He described the emptiness that grew each night as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling while his wife whispered to another man in the dark. He described the humiliation of knowing that every smile, every touch, every kiss she gave him was a performance meant to conceal her real devotion. His words were not loud, but they struck like hammers, each one pounding into Lavra and Daniel until neither could breathe easily. Daniel tried to interrupt, his voice carrying false bravado as he muttered something about accidents and misunderstandings. But Michael's eyes cut to him with a look so cold, so unwavering, that Daniel's words died in his throat. For the first time that night, he realized he wasn't sitting across from a wounded husband seeking explanations. He was sitting across from a man who had already decided what must be done. Michael rose slowly, his movements deliberate, almost graceful, as though he had rehearsed this moment countless times. He walked to the cabinet again, opening it without a word. The sound of the creaking hinges seemed deafening in the silence. Lavra clutched her glass, her hand trembling violently now, as though she expected him to return with something terrible. Michael took his time, shifting bottles and boxes until finally pulling free a small wooden case. He placed it on the coffee table and opened it with care. Inside, neatly arranged, were tools that did not belong to any dinner setting. Lavra gasped quietly, pressing a hand to her mouth, while Daniel sat up straighter, the haze of wine evaporating from his mind. The realization hit both of them at once. Michael had not invited Daniel here to talk. He had invited him into a carefully constructed trap. The warm meal, the expensive wine, the polite conversation, all of it had been a mask, designed to lead to this moment. Michael's voice remained even as he spoke again, explaining not in anger but in chilling rationality. He told them that lies demanded payment, that betrayal could not go unanswered, and that he was not the kind of man to be mocked or discarded. He said it as though it were law, as though the universe itself had written the words and he was only carrying them out. The calmness made it worse because it left no room for negotiation. Rage could be reasoned with, but calm determination could not. Daniel finally stood, trying to reclaim control, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. He tried to speak, his voice louder now, insisting that this had gone far enough. But Michael did not flinch, did not move, did not even blink. He only tilted his head slightly as though studying Daniel like an insect caught in glass. Lavra whispered her husband's name, her voice trembling with desperation, but he ignored her too. What happened next was swift and irreversible. Michael moved with precision, his actions guided not by impulse but by weeks of careful planning. The tools he had prepared were not chosen randomly. They were deliberate, efficient, and final. Daniel struggled, his earlier arrogance vanishing in a flurry of fear and desperation. He shouted, cursed, begged, but the sound carried no power in the closed room. Laura's cries pierced the air, her horror spilling into every corner of the house, but it was too late. The trap had already sprung, and Michael was relentless. When the chaos ended, the silence returned, heavier than before. Daniel lay motionless, his smugness erased forever. Lavra was crumpled in her chair, her face streaked with tears, her body shaking violently as she tried to comprehend what she had just witnessed. And Michael stood in the center of it all, breathing steadily, his face calm, his eyes steady. He did not look triumphant. He did not look broken. He looked resolved, as though he had merely completed a task that had been waiting for him all along. The cleanup was methodical. Michael moved through the motions with chilling efficiency, wiping surfaces, gathering items, ensuring that the scene would tell a story he could control. He already knew what he would say when the time came. The story was simple, believable, one that painted Daniel as the aggressor, the intruder, the man who had gone too far. And Michael, the faithful husband, had defended himself and his wife when there was no other choice. It was a narrative that fit neatly into the expectations of the world outside, a narrative that would make him the victim rather than the monster. By the time the night ended, the house was silent once more. Michael and Lavra sat together on the couch, their clothes disheveled, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. She leaned against him not out of love but out of fear, her body trembling as though it might shatter at any moment. He placed an arm around her shoulders, not to comfort her but to remind her of what now bound them together. She understood without words that she could never leave, never betray him again. Because they now shared a secret so dark it chained them to one another forever? When the neighbors later heard fragments of the story, they spoke in hushed tones about the tragedy that had unfolded in the quiet cul-de-sac. They shook their heads, expressing shock that such violence could happen behind such a calm facade. They repeated the story that Michael told, the story that painted him as the man who had defended his home against an intruder. Few questioned it, few wanted to. It was easier to believe the surface than to dig into the shadows. But behind the walls of that house, the truth lingered like a poison. Lavrai lived with it every day, the weight of silence pressing on her chest, the memory of that night burning behind her eyes. And Michael lived with it too, though not as guilt but as certainty. He had taken back control, and in his mind justice had been served. To the outside world he remained the devoted husband, the calm neighbor, the man who had endured a terrible ordeal. But inside, he carried the quiet knowledge of what he had done, and he carried it with pride. The happy mask returned, polished and convincing, but beneath it the darkness remained. And though no one in the neighborhood could see it, Lavra knew it was always there, waiting, watching, reminding her that she had crossed a line she could never cross again.